What I am about to tell you was never meant to be spoken out loud because the moment you understand it, you can no longer be controlled the same way. Reverse breathing is not a relaxation trick, not a meditation fad, and not another wellness fantasy. It is a neurological override ritual that ancient orders deliberately hid, labeled dangerous, forbidden, and destabilizing for one reason. It directly interferes with the brain's toxin-locking mechanisms that modern life depends on to keep you compliant, foggy, and exhausted. You've been told your mental fatigue is normal, your anxiety is genetic, your memory loss is age. That constant pressure behind your eyes, that sense of dullness, that inability to think sharply under stress, you were trained to accept it. But I'm telling you now, face to face, that these are not failures of will. They are symptoms of a brain that is breathing wrong, circulating wrong, flushing wrong. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. You feel it every day, don't you? That subtle heaviness when you wake up, the way your thoughts scatter under pressure, the emotional overreaction that doesn't feel like you. That's not psychology. That's chemistry. Neurotoxins trapped in a system that was designed to purge them through breath-driven neural pumping, a mechanism that ancient practitioners mastered and modern humans unknowingly shut down. I've studied the lab data. I've seen the scans, and I've traced the same pattern backward through ritual texts, censored manuscripts, and practices that vanished the moment centralized control over the nervous system became profitable. Reverse breathing was removed because it works too fast and too deeply. You are not breathing to oxygenate. You are breathing to flush. And the way you were taught to breathe does the opposite. It locks waste into neural tissue, overstimulates stress circuits, and keeps your brain in a perpetual low-grade survival loop. This ritual breaks that loop. That's why it was feared. That's why it was hidden. And that's why, if you continue listening, you are stepping into territory most people never even realize exists. Because once your brain resets, the old limits stop applying. Right now, inside your skull, something is quietly backing up, and no one warned you it could happen. Your brain produces waste every second you are alive, chemical debris from neurotransmitters firing, stress hormones surging, and neurons burning fuel just to keep you functional. Under natural conditions, that waste is flushed out through a pressure-driven system that depends on breath rhythm, diaphragm movement, and vagus nerve signaling. But your modern breathing pattern has collapsed that system. The result is stagnation. Imagine a city where trash collection never fully arrives, where streets look clean on the surface but rot underneath. That is your nervous system today. This is why focus feels harder than it should. This is why emotional spikes come out of nowhere. This is why you feel mentally tired, even when you've done nothing physical. Neurotoxins don't announce themselves. They dull you slowly. They thicken perception. They mute intuition. And the most dangerous part is that your brain adapts to this poisoned baseline and starts calling it normal. Cortisol stays elevated. The vagus nerve goes silent. The glymphatic system, the brain's internal cleansing network, slows to a crawl. You stay alert, but never clear. Awake, but never sharp. Calm on the outside, inflamed on the inside. Here's what no one tells you. Every inhale you take the conventional way subtly increases intracranial pressure in the wrong direction. It compresses instead of pumps. It signals danger instead of safety. Over time, this trains your nervous system to hold on instead of let go. Reverse breathing flips that signal. It creates a pressure gradient that pulls waste out of neural tissue, reactivates dormant vagal pathways, and tells your brain it is finally safe to clean itself. That's why people report emotional releases, sudden clarity, even discomfort when this process begins. You are not malfunctioning. You are detoxifying. And this is where it becomes uncomfortable, because once you realize that your mental limits are chemically enforced, you can't blame motivation, discipline, or mindset anymore. You see the real enemy. Not stress itself, but trapped stress. Not thoughts, but residue. And you begin to understand why this technique was never taught casually. A brain that can flush itself is a brain that cannot be easily overwhelmed, easily frightened, or easily shaped. Now we cross from suspicion into mechanism, because belief is irrelevant once biology takes over. Reverse breathing works because it hijacks the deepest control systems of your nervous system, the ones that operate long before conscious thought ever appears. At the center of this is the vagus nerve, the master cable running from your brainstem into your organs, blood vessels, and diaphragm. When it is stimulated correctly, it shifts your entire neurological state from threat to repair. When it is suppressed, your brain stays locked in defense mode, prioritizing survival over clarity, cleanup, and regeneration. Conventional breathing patterns barely touch it. Reverse breathing grips it hard. Here's what happens when you reverse the pressure pattern of breath. As you draw the abdomen inward on the inhale, instead of pushing it out, you change the direction of mechanical force transmitted to the brain. Carbon dioxide tolerance rises instead of falling. Cerebral blood vessels dilate instead of constricting. This is not mystical language. This is physics applied to living tissue. Blood flow slows just enough to allow exchange. Neural tissue shifts from high-frequency beta chaos into theta-dominant coherence. And in that state, something critical switches on. Brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, the molecule responsible for neural repair, learning, and synaptic reset. At the same time, the glymphatic system responds to the altered pressure wave. This system does not rely on the heart. It relies on rhythmic expansion and contraction driven by breath and neural tone. Reverse breathing creates a suction effect that pulls metabolic waste out of the spaces between neurons, the exact places where neurotoxins accumulate and interfere with signal transmission. Think of it like flushing sediment from a filter that's been clogged for years. The clarity that follows isn't psychological relief. It's electrical efficiency returning. Autophagy-like processes begin to increase in neural cells, not in the dramatic way people misuse the term, but in a targeted, repair-oriented way. Damaged proteins are broken down. Inflammatory signaling quiets. The brain stops screaming internally and starts listening again. This is why ancient practitioners described this breath as dangerous. It dissolves noise. And a nervous system without noise becomes precise, calm, and extremely difficult to destabilize. Once this mechanism starts, it does not ask for permission from belief. It simply executes. Long before scanners, electrodes, or biochemical assays existed, people noticed something unsettling about this breath. Wherever power structures depended on emotional volatility, fear conditioning, or ritual obedience, reverse breathing was either restricted to inner circles or erased entirely. You can trace it through fragmented monastic instructions, warrior initiation rites, and ascetic disciplines that were never meant for public transmission. The language changes, the symbols shift, but the core instruction remains the same. Reverse the natural flow, invert the pressure, and the mind becomes ungovernable. That was the threat. In certain traditions, this breath was introduced only after years of psychological conditioning because it destabilized identity too quickly. Practitioners reported sudden emotional neutrality, heightened perception, and a loss of impulsive reaction. From the outside, this looked dangerous. A person who no longer reacts predictably cannot be controlled through fear or reward. That is why the technique was labeled forbidden, not because it harmed the body, but because it bypassed social conditioning at the neurological level. Control systems rely on a stressed nervous system. Reverse breathing dismantles that stress from the inside. Historical suppression followed a familiar pattern. Texts were fragmented. Instructions were encoded in metaphor. The breath was described as inverted, sealed, or return to the source. Language vague enough to confuse casual readers, but precise enough for initiates. Over time, the physiological meaning was lost, and what remained was ritual theater without the functional core. Modern science accidentally rediscovered the mechanism while studying vagal tone, CO2 tolerance, and trauma resolution, unaware it was stepping into a ritual space mapped thousands of years earlier. This is why the technique feels both ancient and precise. It was never symbolic. It was always mechanical. And the reason it survived at all is because a few lineages understood something critical. Breath is the only voluntary input into the autonomic nervous system. Change the breath pattern, and you rewrite the operating system. That knowledge doesn't disappear. It waits. And now it's resurfacing, not as mysticism, but as measurable neurobiology. This is the point where precision matters, because reverse breathing is unforgiving to approximation. Done casually, it feels like nothing. Done correctly, it initiates a neurological sequence you cannot fake and cannot rush. You begin seated or standing with the spine upright, not rigid, because the signal must travel cleanly from diaphragm to brainstem. The mouth stays closed. Everything happens through the nose, slow enough that you feel the internal movement before you hear any air. As the inhale begins, you gently draw the lower abdomen inward instead of outward, as if the breath is being pulled up the spine rather than pushed down into the belly. The chest remains relatively quiet. The throat stays relaxed. There is no strain, no force, only controlled reversal. At the top of the inhale, there is a brief natural pause, not held aggressively, just long enough for the nervous system to register the pressure change. This is where most people fail. They rush. That pause is the signal. Then the exhale begins, and here the abdomen releases outward, slowly, deliberately, as if you were pouring weight down through the body. The exhale is longer than the inhale, because this is when flushing occurs. Your attention stays inside, not visual, not imaginative, but somatic, tracking sensation rather than thought. If you feel heat, tingling, or emotional movement, you do not interfere. That is the system responding. The rhythm is steady. The count is secondary. What matters is reversal and continuity. 5 to 10 minutes is enough to trigger the mechanism if done correctly. More is not better. Subtle mistakes cancel the effect, especially lifting the chest, breathing too fast, or forcing retention. This is not about intensity. It is about precision. When done right, the nervous system recognizes an old instruction and follows it automatically. You are not calming yourself. You are issuing a command your brain remembers how to obey. The first changes do not arrive with drama, and that is precisely why they matter. After the initial sessions, the most common signal is a subtle but unmistakable quieting of internal pressure, as if the brain has more space to move. Thoughts still appear, but they no longer collide. Emotional reactions slow just enough for you to notice them before they take over. That night, sleep often reorganizes itself without effort. You drop faster, sink deeper, and wake up with a clarity that feels unfamiliar. Not because it is new, but because you have not felt it in years. This is the nervous system exiting threat mode and reallocating energy toward repair. Within 72 hours of correct practice, the shift becomes structural. Stress no longer floods your system on contact. You respond instead of react. Memory recall improves under pressure, not through effort, but through access. This is the glymphatic system regaining momentum, clearing residue that once distorted signal transmission. Many people describe a strange emotional neutrality during this phase. Not numbness, but stability. The brain is no longer dragging yesterday's chemistry into today's decisions. By day 7, the baseline itself begins to move. Focus becomes sustained rather than forced. Anxiety weakens because its fuel source has been reduced. Cortisol rhythms normalize. Theta access improves, making insight and learning feel automatic. By day 21, the transformation locks in. Regulation replaces vigilance. Calm replaces tension. You are no longer fighting your mind or managing your state. The system runs clean. And once the brain remembers how to flush itself, it resists returning to dysfunction. This is not a peak state. This is a reset. Now comes the moment most people hesitate, because this is where understanding turns into responsibility. Once you know that your mental limits are chemically enforced, that your anxiety, fog, and reactivity were maintained by a breathing pattern you never chose, you can't unknow it. And when you begin this protocol seriously, resistance will appear. Not failure, resistance. Discomfort, restlessness, an urge to quit or distract yourself. That is not weakness. That is the nervous system shedding a state it has defended for years. Old tension does not leave quietly. It argues. It negotiates. It lies. This is the challenge. You commit to precision, not motivation. You practice even when nothing dramatic happens, especially then, because the absence of sensation is often the deepest correction taking place. You do not chase experiences. You allow the reset. And you understand that a brain that can flush itself becomes harder to manipulate, harder to overwhelm, harder to scare. That is the real danger of this technique. Not to you, but to any system that relies on your instability. I am not asking you to believe. I am telling you to test. Follow the protocol exactly. Observe the timeline. Let the data come from your own nervous system. If you stop halfway, nothing changes. If you persist, the old baseline dissolves. And once it does, there is no going back to unconscious breathing, unconscious thinking, unconscious living. This is a line. Step over it deliberately.